Digging in the Dirt with Dr. David Lipovich.
Welcome to the third episode of Digging in the Dirt entitled New World Man. The world of Homo erectus was very different from our own. In the Near East, the Paleolithic era, or more simply the Old Stone Age, named for the reliance of our ancestors at the time on flake stone tools, spans the period from about 1.7 million years ago until about 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. It falls during a geological epoch known as the Pleistocene. The blue patches you see on the maps here indicate the greatest extent of continental glaciation. You can see that the Near East is free of the ice and easily accessible from Northeast Africa. In case you are wondering how we figure out all these dates, the date of such very ancient finds is usually calculated by dating the sediments in which the artifacts and remains are found. This is done using methods borrowed from physics, particularly potassium-argon dating, which is based on measurement of the decay of potassium into argon in the sediment. Sometimes we can date a site based on when an extinct animal lived whose remains were found there. It is very rare for us to be able to actually date either the bones or tools themselves in these really early situations. The climate during the Pleistocene was marked by a long period of alternating ice ages, glaciations, and warm breaks, interglacials. As a result, for much of this period, the climate would have been colder and, more importantly, drier than today, and the region would have been surrounded by continental and large alpine glaciers. The Mediterranean coast would have been much further offshore than today due to the amount of water trapped in these continent-sized glaciers in Europe and North America, making the modern coastal cliffs and caves be at the eastern edge of large flat plains. This would have made the areas around the Great Rift Valley, which includes both the Nile and Jordan rivers, and the Mediterranean coast, prime real estate for our pre-human ancestors. The earliest evidence for our lower Paleolithic ancestors living in the Near East comes from the site of Ubeidiya. The site, excavated primarily during the early 1960s, was located near the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel and was dated to between 1.5 and 1.7 million years ago, based on the ages of the fossilized animal remains found at the site, including a now extinct form of wild cattle found alongside the Homo erectus remains. The site was found to contain more than 10,000 stone tools, assumed to have been left behind by Homo erectus migrating from Africa to Asia through what is now modern-day Israel. These remains consisted primarily of stone hand axes made in the Acheulean style that we saw last episode. Similar finds have been made at Gesher Bnot Yaakov on the Jordan River in Israel, dated to 790,000 years ago. At Kesem Cave near Tel Aviv, where some of the earliest evidence has been found for the controlled use of fire used there to roast the flesh of fallow deer, roe deer, and red deer, as well as wild cattle, horse, ass, pig, and goat, dated to around 300,000 years ago, and at Brechat Ram in the Golan, dated to 230,000 years ago. Brechat Ram is the site of the Venus of Brechat Ram, a pebble thought by some to have been modified to create a female figurine, which would make it the earliest figural art ever discovered. It is 35 millimeters long and weighs approximately 10 grams. It was dated to 280 to 250,000 years ago. You may have to squint a bit to recognize the form of what is thought to be a Rubenesque female body. Outside of Israel, we also have evidence in other parts of the Near East for Homo erectus at Yabrud in Syria, Kharga and Dakhlo oases in Egypt, Barda Balka in Iraqi Kurdistan, Ganjpar, and a number of other sites in the Kashafrud River Basin in Iran. Around 600,000 years ago, a new species of hominin appeared in Africa, Homo heidelbergensis. They evolved from the Homo erectus population that had not left Africa. This new species would eventually also spread from Africa to Eurasia. With the return of continental glaciation to Europe, some of the populations of this hominid were isolated and developed along divergent lines. In Europe, around 300,000 years ago, a new species of hominin appeared that was better adapted to colder climates. It was a descendant of those Homo heidelbergensis that had been isolated by the onset of another ice age in Europe. This species is Homo neanderthalensis, better known to most of us as the Neanderthals. Those Homo heidelbergensis that stayed in Africa evolved into the earliest form of Homo sapiens, but more on them in the upcoming episodes. The Near East, as a crossroad between these regions, is remarkable in being home to all of these species. At Tabun Cave at Mount Carmel on the coast of Israel, evidence was found by its excavator, Arthur Jelinek, for an occupation, probably by Homo heidelbergensis, of the site as far back as 500,000 years ago. The earliest levels of the site contain pollen traces typical of warm climate vegetation alongside sea sand, suggesting a warm climate with higher sea levels. The Mediterranean coastal plain at this time would likely have been a savanna, filled with gazelle, hippopotami, and wild cattle, which were hunted by the occupants. While there is, as yet, no skeletal evidence for either Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis in the Near East, there is considerable evidence for Neanderthals and for archaic Homo sapiens, which again we will talk about in our upcoming episode. Neanderthals left a considerable amount of evidence for their presence in the Near East, most often in the form of their stone tools. The actual skeletal remains of Neanderthals are quite rare in the Near East, and when found are usually quite fragmentary. The earliest Near Eastern Neanderthal remains recovered to date are from Karain Cave near Antalya, Turkey, where evidence was found for occupation of the site as far back as 200,000 years ago. Finds included a fragment of a Neanderthal skull alongside bone and stone tools. A number of sites with Neanderthal remains have been excavated that may give us some sense of their cultural behavior and of the world they lived in. One such example is the previously mentioned Tabun Cave in Israel. The more recent levels of the site consisted of clay and silt, suggesting a cooler, more humid climate had returned. This reflects the return of continental glaciation, a new ice age, and the drop in the level of the Mediterranean Sea. This would have created a much broader coastal plain covered by dense forest and swamps. The finds associated with this later, cooler period are typical of the Mousterian tool complex associated with the Neanderthals. This new technology is found throughout Western Europe, the Near East, and into Central Asia. The key new development in this toolkit is known as the Levallois technique. The technique involves the striking of flakes from a prepared flint core. The core's edges are trimmed by flaking off pieces around the outline of the desired larger flake. This creates a core reminiscent of a tortoiseshell. Finally, a large central flake is separated from the core, which has all of its edges sharpened by the preliminary preparation of the core. The resulting flakes could be used as a scraper for treating hides, or a knife, or as the basis for a spear point. The pictures you see here are all examples of Mousterian flakes found at sites in Israel. Alongside the artifactual remains, a Neanderthal female, dated to about 122,000 years ago, and a set of teeth from another individual, dated to about 90,000 years ago, were recovered from the site of Tabun. A very key player in our understanding of early hominin remains in the Near East is the woman you see there on the left. That's Dorothy Garrod. She was the first female professor at Cambridge University and one of the key early investigators of the Near Eastern Paleolithic. She excavated Neanderthal sites all around the Near East between 1925 and 1952. In many cases, her sites were excavated by entirely female crews. Among the Neanderthal sites she excavated were Kibara Cave in the Mount Carmel range of northern Israel, Shukba Cave near the Wadi en-Natuf in the West Bank, Ras El Kelb near Beirut, where she found a Neanderthal tooth dated to 52,000 years ago, Adlun, sometimes called Bezez Cave, in south-central Lebanon, and at Khazar Merd in Iraqi Kurdistan. In several cases, the sites show evidence of deliberate disposal of the dead in a manner which presupposes some sort of belief either in an afterlife or at least a need for a reverent disposal of the dead as opposed to just tossing them out as so much waste. One of the more unusual examples of this comes from Dedaria Cave in Syria, where a 2-year-old infant's burial was discovered. The individual's bones had been stripped of their flesh and taken apart into their individual skeletal elements before burial, and carefully placed in the burial in correct anatomical placement. It has been suggested that this reflects both a ritual importance to the correct disposal of the dead by Neanderthals, as well as a devotion to their young, not always seen in later Homo sapiens. One of the things that is actually pretty commonplace in the sort of early stages of the development of civilization in the Near East is to dispose of infants by simply throwing them into the waste from day-to-day life, or at best burying them under the floor of a house. This early example shows a dedication to these young children that we often don't expect from later civilizations in the region. This shows a very early attachment to a member of the Neanderthal community who really wouldn't have been able to contribute anything to that community. Probably the best known Near Eastern Neanderthal site is at Shanidar Cave in what today is Iraqi Kurdistan. It was excavated from 1915 to 1961 by Ralph Selecki, but the recovered remains continue to be studied today. It yielded 10 Neanderthal skeletons, the oldest which dated to about 80,000 years ago. The 10th individual was only recently identified by Melinda Zader while examining the animal remains from the excavations. Evidence was found for deliberate burial of the dead, possibly with grave offerings, and for the conscious care of injured or ill individuals within their society. 3 skeletons were buried alongside each other, Shanidar 1, 2, and 3. Shanidar 1 was a 40 to 50-year-old male, the equivalent in modern terms of an 80-year-old, who had suffered a violent blow to his face during his lifetime, which would have left him at least partially blind in one eye. He also had a withered right arm, the result of several poorly healed fractures during childhood, and deformities in his legs and feet, which would have left him with a severe limp. Shanidar 2 was an adult male buried under a pile of stones, topped with a group of stone tools, suggesting a deliberate burial ritual, possibly an assumption that the tools might be needed in a perceived afterlife. Shanidar 3 showed signs of arthritis and a degenerative joint disorder. The fact that all of these individuals, despite their infirmities, lived out long lives reflects a supportive community that took care of its own. Another interesting burial at the site is Shanidar 4, often referred to as the flower burial. The burial consisted of a 30 to 45-year-old male Neanderthal buried in a near fetal position. Clusters of flower pollen were found alongside the burial from plants that are thought to have medicinal properties. This led to the belief by some that the individual was buried with either a funeral bouquet or a collection of medicinal herbs, suggesting that he might have been the band's shaman. Neanderthal finds were also made at Hayonim Cave in the Upper Galilee of Israel, Ksarakil near Beirut, Lebanon, where a Neanderthal upper jawbone was found, and at Bisatun Cave, Warwasi, and Kalibozi in Iran. In the next episode, entitled The Ascent of Man, we will discuss the finds associated with the earliest members of our species, Homo sapiens, that we find in the Near East.
If you are enjoying Digging in the Dirt and would like to help us continue to produce more episodes, please spread the word about our series and send us a small gratuity to show your support using the following link, tinyurl.com/3rxdkvt4.